become the person you're afraid to face. Not the version of yourself you present to the world, not the identity you've learned to perform, but the one you quietly avoid when no one is watching. The one whose presence makes you uneasy, whose emergence feels dangerous, and whose existence you would rather keep theoretical than real. This fear does not come from weakness, it comes from proximity. You are not afraid of something distant or unknown. You are afraid of something that lives uncomfortably close to who you already are. Most people believe fear exists to protect them from harm, from loss, from failure or rejection. But there is another kind of fear that operates beneath the surface of conscious thought, one that has little to do with danger and everything to do with identity. This fear arises when you sense that becoming more honest with yourself would require dismantling the version of you that has kept your life stable, predictable, and socially acceptable. It is the fear that if you truly faced yourself, you would no longer fit so neatly into the roles you've learned to inhabit. From an early age, you learned which parts of you were welcomed and which were quietly discouraged. You were rewarded for being manageable, agreeable, and composed, and corrected when you were too loud, too emotional, too demanding, or too intense. Over time, these lessons shaped not just your behavior, but your sense of self. You didn't simply learn how to act, you learned who it was safer to be. And in doing so, you also learned who not to become. The person you are afraid to face is often the one who carries everything that did not fit within those early boundaries. The anger that was labeled inappropriate, the desire that was called excessive, the ambition that felt threatening, the sensitivity that was dismissed as weakness. None of these traits disappeared. They were set aside, buried beneath layers of adaptation, while you learned to function in a world that rewarded control more than authenticity. On the surface, this adaptation works. You build a life that appears coherent. You make choices that seem reasonable. You follow paths that offer security, approval, or status. You may even feel proud of your discipline and restraint. Yet beneath this surface lies a subtle but persistent tension, a sense that something in your life remains unresolved. You may struggle to name it, but you feel it as restlessness, emotional flatness, or a quiet dissatisfaction that success does not seem to resolve. This is often most noticeable in moments of stillness, when there is nothing left to manage or perform. Late at night, when distractions fall away. Early in the morning, before the day demands your attention. In these moments, a familiar unease emerges, accompanied by questions you instinctively push aside. Why does my life feel disconnected from my inner world? Why do my choices feel more like obligations than expressions of who I am? Why does being fine feel so empty? You might try to explain these feelings away. You tell yourself you are stressed, overworked, or simply going through a phase. You assume that clarity will come later, once things settle, or once you reach the next milestone. But the unease persists, because it is not asking for solutions, it is asking for recognition. It is the psychological cost of avoiding a deeper confrontation with yourself. The fear of facing yourself is not the fear of discovering something broken or shameful. More often, it is the fear of discovering something powerful, demanding, and alive. A part of you that may no longer be willing to accept compromises that keep you comfortable but constrained. A part of you that may challenge relationships built on convenience rather than truth. A part of you that may insist on change even when change feels destabilizing. This is why the fear feels so personal. Facing this version of yourself does not feel like growth, it feels like risk. It threatens the identity you have relied on, the roles you have mastered, and the sense of control you have worked so hard to maintain. To face yourself honestly would mean admitting that much of your life has been shaped by avoidance, not because you lacked courage, but because survival demanded adaptation. Over time, this avoidance becomes internalized. You begin to associate safety with self-suppression and danger with self-expression. You learn to distrust your own impulses, question your emotional responses, and downplay desires that feel inconvenient or disruptive. You call this maturity or self-discipline, but beneath it lies a growing distance between who you are and who you allow yourself to be. The internal threat is not that this avoided self will suddenly take over and ruin your life. The real threat is that continuing to avoid it will slowly erode your sense of meaning, vitality, and authenticity. The more you distance yourself from this part of you, the more fragmented your inner world becomes. And fragmentation, over time, manifests as anxiety, emptiness, and a feeling of being trapped inside a life that no longer feels like your own. The person you are afraid to face is not an enemy waiting to destroy you. It is a neglected part of your psyche, carrying energy, emotion, and truth that has never been fully integrated. Avoiding this person may preserve short-term stability, but it comes at the cost of long-term wholeness. And the fear you feel when you sense their presence is not a warning to turn away. It is an invitation to look closer, even if what you find unsettles the identity you've been protecting. This is where the real journey begins, not with self-improvement, but with self-confrontation. Not with becoming better, but with becoming whole. And that process starts the moment you stop running from the person you're afraid to face. Long before you ever asked who you truly are, you were taught who you were expected to be. This education did not happen through lectures or deliberate instruction. It happened quietly, through reactions, rewards, and consequences. You learned which behaviors brought approval and which invited discomfort, which emotions were welcomed and which were met with silence, correction, or shame. Over time, you adjusted, not because you were weak, but because adaptation is how the human psyche survives. You learned to read the room, to sense what was acceptable, to anticipate expectations before they were spoken. And with every adjustment, you refined a version of yourself that fit more smoothly into the world around you. This version was polite, controlled, and appropriate. It knew when to speak and when to remain silent. It understood how to avoid conflict and how to remain likable. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, this adapted self became familiar, reliable, safe. What you may not have realized is that this version of you was never meant to be the whole of who you are. It was meant to be an interface, a way of functioning within social systems that require compromise and restraint. Yet over time, the boundary between function and identity began to blur. You stopped seeing this version as something you do and began to believe it was who you are. This is how the mask becomes fused with the self. At first, wearing it feels empowering. You feel competent. You feel in control. You feel like you understand how the world works and how to navigate it successfully. People respond positively. Life becomes more predictable, and predictability feels like safety. But beneath this sense of stability, something subtle begins to shift. The more you rely on the mask, the more distant you become from the parts of yourself that do not align with it. You start editing your thoughts before they are spoken. You filter your emotions before they are felt. You dismiss impulses that feel inconvenient or disruptive. You tell yourself that this is maturity, professionalism, or emotional intelligence. But what is often happening beneath these labels is self-censorship, a quiet, ongoing negotiation in which parts of you are consistently overruled for the sake of maintaining order. The mask itself is not the problem. Every society requires some degree of role-playing. We all need a way to interact, cooperate, and coexist. The problem arises when the mask stops being a role and starts being mistaken for the self. When you forget that it is something you wear, not something you are. At that point, the cost of adaptation becomes internal rather than external. One of the first signs of this cost is emotional disconnection. You may still feel emotions, but they arrive muted, contained, or delayed. Anger becomes irritation. Desire becomes distraction. Sadness becomes fatigue. You remain functional, but less alive. You may notice that you struggle to access your instincts or trust your own reactions. Decisions feel calculated rather than felt. Life becomes manageable, but not meaningful. Another sign is the gradual erosion of authenticity in your relationships. When you interact through the mask, connection becomes conditional. You are accepted for what you present, not for what you actually feel. This can lead to a strange form of loneliness, one that exists even in the presence of others. You are seen but not known, included but not understood. And over time, you may find yourself craving distance, not because you dislike people, but because constant performance is exhausting. You may also notice an increasing fear of your own emotional depth. Strong feelings begin to feel threatening rather than informative. You worry that if you let yourself feel too much, speak too honestly, or want too intensely, you will disrupt the balance you've worked so hard to maintain. And so you keep yourself contained. You learn to equate control with safety and expression with risk. This is where the mask quietly turns into a prison. The traits you suppress do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. They remain active beneath the surface, influencing your thoughts, reactions, and patterns in indirect ways. The more you deny them conscious expression, the more they seek expression through tension, resentment, or inner conflict. You may find yourself feeling irritated without knowing why, drained without a clear cause, or dissatisfied even when things are going well. At this stage, many people double down on the mask. They try to become even more controlled, more reasonable, more composed. They tell themselves that if they just manage themselves better, the discomfort will go away. But what they are actually managing is not chaos, but vitality. Not dysfunction, but parts of themselves that have never been given a legitimate place to exist. The irony is that the mask, which once protected you, now protects you from yourself. It shields you not only from rejection, but from intimacy, not only from conflict, but from purpose. You become skilled at avoiding discomfort, but in doing so, you also avoid the very experiences that make life feel real. This avoidance creates a growing internal divide. On one side is the version of you that knows how to function, comply, and maintain stability. On the other is a quieter presence, one that carries unexpressed emotion, unrealized desire, and instincts that were never given space to develop. The more you identify with the mask, the more foreign this inner presence begins to feel. Eventually, it becomes something you fear. You may not consciously think of it as fear. It may show up as reluctance, hesitation, or resistance, a sense that being fully honest, fully expressive, or fully yourself would somehow be irresponsible or dangerous. But this fear is not irrational. It is the fear of losing the structure that has held your life together. The fear that without the mask, you would not know who you are or how to exist. And yet, the longer you remain fused to the mask, the more constrained your inner world becomes. The parts of you that do not fit are not erased, they are simply excluded. And exclusion, over time, leads to fragmentation. The self becomes divided into what is allowed and what is hidden, what is shown and what is suppressed, what is lived and what is avoided. This is the quiet cost of mistaking the mask for the self. It keeps you safe but incomplete, accepted but divided. And as long as this division remains unexamined, the person you are afraid to face will continue to grow in the background, not because they want to destroy your life, but because they want to be included in it. When parts of you are pushed aside long enough, they do not disappear. They adapt. They move underground, they wait. And while you may believe you are living freely, making rational choices, and directing your life with intention, these forgotten parts often begin to influence you from a place you no longer recognize as your own. This is the paradox most people never confront. The very traits you avoid in yourself are often the ones shaping your behavior in indirect and unconscious ways. The anger you learn to suppress does not vanish. It resurfaces as resentment, irritability, or sudden emotional outbursts that seem to come from nowhere. The desire you were taught to restrain does not die. It reappears as dissatisfaction, envy, or a vague sense of longing you cannot explain. The confidence you were discouraged from claiming does not dissolve. It mutates into self-doubt, hesitation, or a constant comparison with others. What you deny expression does not become weaker. It becomes distorted. This is how the forgotten self begins to operate behind the scenes. Not as a single dramatic force, but as a pattern, a tone, a background influence that quietly shapes how you react to the world. You may find yourself repeatedly sabotaging opportunities that would require you to step forward visibly. You may feel inexplicably threatened by people who embody traits you disowned in yourself. You may notice recurring conflicts in relationships that follow the same emotional script, no matter how different the circumstances appear on the surface. These patterns are not coincidences. They are expressions of an inner division that has never been resolved. One of the most revealing signs of this division is emotional overreaction. When something minor provokes an outsized response, it is often because the reaction is not about the present moment alone. It is connected to something older, something accumulated, something that has been denied a voice for too long. The intensity does not come from weakness, but from compression. Energy that has been held back eventually demands release. Another sign is projection. You may notice that certain people irritate you disproportionately. Their confidence feels offensive. Their ambition feels threatening. Their emotional expressiveness feels excessive. Their assertiveness feels aggressive. What makes these reactions revealing is not the traits themselves, but the emotional charge attached to them. The stronger the reaction, the more likely it is that what you are responding to is not only them, but a part of yourself you were taught not to embody. This is how the forgotten self communicates, not through clear messages, but through friction. You might assume that ignoring these reactions is a sign of maturity, that rising above them means you are in control. But suppression does not resolve the underlying conflict. It merely delays it. And the longer it is delayed, the more entrenched it becomes. Over time, the forgotten self stops asking for inclusion and begins demanding it through disruption. This is why so many people feel trapped in cycles they cannot explain. They change jobs, relationships, cities, or goals, only to find the same emotional patterns repeating. The external details shift, but the internal dynamic remains the same. The problem is not the environment. It is the unresolved relationship with parts of the self that were never allowed to mature. The forgotten self is often misunderstood as something dangerous or destructive. People fear that if they allow these suppressed traits to surface, they will lose control, hurt others, or become someone they do not recognize. But this fear is based on a misunderstanding. The danger does not come from awareness. It comes from unconsciousness. Traits that are denied conscious expression do not become harmless. They become unpredictable. When anger is unconscious, it erupts without context. When desire is unconscious, it seeks satisfaction in ways that undermine integrity. When power is unconscious, it expresses itself through manipulation, passive aggression, or self-sabotage. Conscious traits can be directed. Unconscious traits act on their own. This is why the part of you left behind often feels threatening. It has been deprived of development. It has not been integrated into your values, your judgment, or your sense of responsibility. It exists in a raw, unrefined state, not because it is inherently destructive, but because it was never given the chance to grow up. The longer this part remains excluded, the more foreign it feels. Eventually, it begins to seem like an intruder rather than a fragment of yourself. You speak about it as if it was something separate, something to be controlled or eliminated. You say things like, "That's not who I am," without realizing that the force behind those reactions comes from within the same psyche you claim to understand. This internal split creates exhaustion. Maintaining the mask requires constant effort. Suppressing unwanted impulses requires vigilance. Monitoring your reactions requires restraint. Over time, this effort drains energy that could otherwise be used for creativity, connection, and growth. You may find yourself feeling tired without a clear reason, unmotivated despite having goals, or emotionally numb even in moments that should matter. What is happening is not a lack of discipline, but a lack of integration. The part of you left behind is not trying to destroy the life you've built. It is responding to exclusion. It is seeking acknowledgement, development, and a place within your conscious identity. Ignoring it does not make it go away. It simply ensures that it continues to influence you from a place you cannot see or control. This is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. As long as these parts remain unconscious, they will shape your life without your consent. They will influence who you trust, what you pursue, what you avoid, and how you react, all while convincing you that these patterns are simply how things are. The forgotten self does not disappear with time, it grows more insistent. And the longer it remains unexamined, the more power it gains over your choices. Not because it is stronger than you, but because it is closer to the core of who you are than the version of yourself you have been presenting to the world. Facing this reality is unsettling because it forces you to confront the limits of control. It challenges the idea that you have been living entirely by choice. But it also opens the door to something most people never experience, the possibility of reclaiming the parts of yourself that were never wrong, only unwelcome. And this realization leads to an even more difficult question. If the parts you fear are not your enemies, then what is it that truly keeps you divided? What fears stand between you and wholeness? That is where the next stage of this journey begins. If the parts of you that were left behind are not inherently dangerous, then the question becomes unavoidable. What is it that truly prevents you from facing them? The answer is not a single fear, but a set of deeply rooted psychological fears that operate beneath awareness, quietly shaping your decisions and reinforcing the inner division you have learned to live with. The first fear is moral collapse. Many people believe, often without ever questioning it, that acknowledging their darker or more intense impulses would make them a worse person. They assume that anger equals cruelty, desire equals immorality, ambition equals selfishness, and power equals corruption. As a result, repression is mistaken for virtue. The more tightly these impulses are controlled, the more good one believes oneself to be. But this belief rests on a fragile illusion. What makes a person dangerous is not awareness of their impulses, but ignorance of them. Traits that are consciously recognized can be examined, guided, and restrained when necessary. Traits that are denied remain unexamined, acting out in distorted and indirect ways. Repression does not eliminate darkness, it removes responsibility for it. And responsibility, not denial, is what creates ethical behavior. The second fear cuts closer to survival, the fear of rejection. At some point in your life, belonging became conditional. You learned, explicitly or implicitly, that acceptance depended on how well you fit the expectations around you. Authentic expression threatened connection. Compliance preserved it. Over time, this lesson became internalized. You stopped asking whether something was true for you and started asking whether it would be tolerated. This fear is not imaginary. When people stop performing, some relationships do change. Some bonds weaken, some dynamics dissolve. But what often goes unrecognized is that the rejection has already been happening, just in a quieter form. Every time you silence your own truth to maintain harmony, you reinforce a deeper rejection, one that comes not from others, but from yourself. The pain of external rejection feels sharp, but the pain of self-rejection accumulates slowly, hollowing out your sense of worth from the inside. The third fear is the fear of power. For many, power has been associated with harm, domination, or abuse. Perhaps you witnessed authority misused, boundaries violated, or strength turned against others. In response, you learned to associate safety with smallness. You chose to be accommodating rather than assertive, agreeable rather than grounded. You told yourself it was better to be harmless than to risk becoming dangerous. Yet power does not disappear when it is denied, it simply expresses itself indirectly. Suppressed power often leaks out as resentment, sarcasm, manipulation, or chronic passivity. It creates a sense of being overlooked or taken advantage of, followed by guilt for feeling that way. Integrated power, by contrast, does not seek domination, it creates clarity. It allows you to say no without hostility, to occupy space without apology, and to act decisively without needing to justify your existence. The fourth fear is the most unsettling of all, the fear of losing your identity. Much of who you believe yourself to be has been defined by what you are not. You are not angry. You are not selfish. You are not intense. You are not like those people. These negations form the backbone of your self-image. But what happens when the traits you rejected turn out to be essential parts of you? What happens when the identity you've relied on begins to collapse? This fear feels like death because psychologically it is. The familiar structure of the self dissolves, the ego resists, it panics. It clings to old definitions, even when they no longer fit. But what is dying in this process is not your true self. It is the image you constructed to survive, the persona that kept you safe but incomplete. These fears do not mean you are weak. They mean you are human. They exist because the psyche prioritizes stability over wholeness, especially in environments where authenticity carries real consequences. But when these fears go unexamined, they become invisible chains. They keep you divided, cautious, and emotionally restrained long after the original threats have passed. What makes these fears particularly powerful is that they disguise themselves as reason. They tell you that staying as you are is responsible, mature, and sensible. They frame change as reckless and self-confrontation as unnecessary. They encourage you to remain functional rather than fulfilled. And because they operate quietly, they often go unquestioned for years. Yet each of these fears serves as a gate rather than a wall. On the other side of the fear of moral collapse lies responsibility. On the other side of the fear of rejection lies authenticity. On the other side of the fear of power lies agency. And on the other side of the fear of identity loss lies integration. The fears are not signals to turn back. They are indicators that you are standing at the threshold of something essential. Remaining divided may feel safer in the short term, but it comes at the cost of long-term vitality. The psyche cannot remain split indefinitely without consequence. Anxiety, emptiness, and chronic dissatisfaction are not personal failures. They are signals that the internal system is strained by contradiction. Something within you is asking to be included, not indulged, but acknowledged and developed. To move forward does not require reckless action or dramatic upheaval. It requires honesty. It requires the willingness to question the assumptions that have governed your self-image and to recognize that what you fear losing may never have been real in the first place. The self that survives confrontation is not weaker, but more grounded because it is no longer built on avoidance. The moment you recognize these fears for what they are, they lose some of their power. They become landmarks rather than obstacles. And once that happens, a different question emerges, one that shifts the focus from fear to responsibility. If wholeness is possible, then what does it actually demand of you in real life? What does it mean to stop avoiding and begin integrating? That is where the final stage of this journey begins. If you reach this point honestly, something subtle has already changed. The question is no longer whether the divided parts of you exist, but whether you are willing to live with the consequences of acknowledging them. This is where most people hesitate, not because they lack understanding, but because understanding demands responsibility. Becoming the person you're afraid to face is not an abstract insight. It is a lived decision that reshapes how you relate to yourself, to others, and to the world. Integration does not feel like relief at first. It feels like instability. When suppressed parts begin to re-enter awareness, they rarely arrive politely. Emotions intensify. Old certainties weaken. The identity you relied on becomes less convincing. You may feel more sensitive, more reactive, or more uncertain than before. This does not mean something has gone wrong. It means the internal structure that kept everything contained is loosening, making room for something more complete to emerge. Many people expect personal growth to feel empowering from the beginning. They imagine clarity, confidence, and peace. But integration often begins with discomfort because it removes the buffer that protected you from yourself. You no longer have the same distance from your anger, your desire, your ambition, or your vulnerability. You feel more exposed, less managed. And that exposure can feel dangerous to a psyche trained to survive through control. One of the first signs that integration is taking place is a change in how you relate to approval. You may notice that you are less willing to agree automatically, less inclined to smooth things over at your own expense, and less motivated to maintain harmony at all costs. This does not mean you become careless or hostile. It means your internal reference point is shifting. Instead of asking, "Will this be accepted?" you begin asking, "Is this true for me?" As this shift deepens, your relationships may begin to change. Some connections strengthen as honesty replaces performance. Others weaken as the unspoken agreements that held them together no longer apply. This can be painful, but it is also clarifying. Relationships that depend on you remaining small, predictable, or self-suppressing cannot survive integration. Those that are grounded in mutual respect and authenticity often deepen. Another sign of integration is increased emotional range. You feel more, not less. Joy becomes fuller, anger becomes clearer, sadness becomes more direct. This can feel overwhelming at first, especially if you spent years numbing or managing your inner life. But emotional intensity is not pathology. It is vitality returning to areas that were previously cut off. What matters is not the presence of emotion, but your relationship to it. As integration continues, something unexpected often happens. You become less defensive. Criticism does not destabilize you as easily because you are no longer protecting a fragile image. You know your flaws. You know your capacity for harm as well as for care. You have faced your contradictions instead of denying them. This creates a groundedness that does not depend on being seen as good, right, or admirable. Energy also begins to return, not in a euphoric sense, but in a steady, usable way. The energy that was once spent suppressing impulses, monitoring reactions, and maintaining the mask becomes available for action, creativity, and connection. You may feel more present in your body, more decisive in your choices, and more willing to take risks that align with your values rather than your fears. Importantly, integration does not make life easy. You still struggle. You still make mistakes. Old patterns still surface under stress. But the difference is that these patterns are no longer mysterious. You recognize them. You take responsibility for them. You work with them rather than against them. This is what transforms inner conflict into inner dialogue. Becoming the person you're afraid to face does not mean indulging every impulse or abandoning all restraint. It means allowing previously rejected parts of yourself to mature within consciousness. It means developing discernment rather than relying on repression. The goal is not to be unfiltered, but to be whole, to act with awareness rather than compulsion. Over time, this wholeness changes how you experience fear itself. Fear no longer functions solely as a stop signal. It becomes a compass. When something frightens you in a deep, personal way, you begin to ask not only what it threatens, but what it might be pointing toward. Often, the things that provoke the most fear are the very things that demand growth, honesty, and courage. This is why the person you are afraid to face is rarely a monster. More often, it is the part of you that knows what you want, what you will no longer tolerate, and what you are capable of becoming. Avoiding that person may preserve comfort, but it limits possibility. Facing them disrupts the familiar, but it opens the door to a life that feels lived from the inside rather than performed from the outside. Integration is not a finish line. It is an ongoing process of negotiation, reflection, and adjustment. There is no final version of the self that remains fixed forever, but there is a way of relating to yourself that is more honest, more grounded, and more resilient, a way that does not require constant self-betrayal to maintain stability. If you notice yourself becoming less predictable, more discerning, and less willing to disappear for the sake of comfort, you are not losing yourself. You are reclaiming parts of yourself that were never allowed to exist openly. If you feel more alive but also more responsible for your choices, you are not regressing. You are integrating, so when fear arises, pause before you turn away. Ask what it is protecting and what it might be preventing. The person you're afraid to face is not standing in your way. They are standing at the threshold of a fuller life, waiting for you to stop running and start listening. And the moment you do, the internal division that once controlled you begins to dissolve, not into perfection, but into something far more sustainable: wholeness.